The NFL playoffs start on Saturday. We'll tell you why you shouldn't overreact to big playoff performances next.
You are Locked On Dynasty Football, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. Here are your hosts, Marcus Mosher and Kate Madjuk.
Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. You'll start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets. No matter if you win or lose, just go place your first $5 bet on FanDuel.com and get started. Welcome back. I am your host, Marcus Mosher. You can follow me on Twitter at Marcus_Mosher. Joining me today, as always, is Kate Madjuk. You can follow her on Twitter at Kate Madjuk. And it's a Wednesday show, so of course that means Matt Williamson is here. Follow him on Twitter at WilliamsonNFL. On today's show, we're going to talk about some of our biggest dynasty regrets this year, some offseason trade targets. But Matt, I want to start with this first. Every year we'll see a player or two put together a monster postseason. And it's really hard not to overreact to those big postseason performances. So how do we weigh what happens in the postseason compared to what we saw 17 weeks in the regular season?
Yeah, I think this is important and could be a very long conversation. But I do think we know pretty much for a fact that any standalone game, Monday Night Football, Sunday Night Football, people overreact. You know, I mean, there's a lot of eyes on it. It's easy to overreact because you see every play. You're not just watching red zone or box score scouting or, looking at your team. Oh, he got 9 more yards. I got, 0.9 points or whatever, and that's magnified times 1,000 in the playoffs. Man, Lamar can't win a playoff game. We'll get rid of him. No. Don't do those things. So I do think there's much to take from it because it's a high level of competition. That's probably the scout background to me more than anything. If you watch a college kid, I want to watch Bama LSU. I don't want to watch Bama Alabama State. It's the best to evaluate the Bama kids. So I think it's a great, great tool to watch these guys. How do they perform against the best competition with the most pressure? Can I count on them? But I would say, just from experience, that the dynasty community probably overreacts.
Kate, what do you think?
I mean, as somebody who watched the entire dynasty community go cuckoo crazy over Gabe Davis a couple of years ago, yeah, I think we have a tendency to overreact. And I mean, let's be honest, that's just kind of recency bias. We know that as a psychological theory. That's a human tendency that we have. But I tend to agree with Matt that this is actually a really probably underrated aspect of playoff performance is the ability to evaluate these players against top tier talent. This is your chance to kind of see what you're made of. And, if you can thrive against top tier competition, usually that means good things. And usually, I'm going to weigh, maybe a player's ability to face a tough defense favorably in a good way. I think it is a tool. It's just one that you have to wield with caution and without a tendency to overreact. I think you just have to be very measured in your approach. And again, kind of like everything in Dynasty, it has its context.
Matt, doesn't it depend a little bit on the player? For example, last year, we saw Travis Kelce have a really poor regular season. Mm-hmm. He was awesome in the postseason. It was clear that the Chiefs were just saving him. And then this year, not great in the regular seasons. But if it's a young player who, let's use Rashee Rice, same offense, kind of got better as the year went along during his rookie season and then was awesome in the postseason, I think you get a little bit more excited about some of the young players that are performing well rather than the older players, correct?
Couldn't agree more. I know he's unlikely to play this week, but let's say Zay Flowers would light up the Steelers and then light up the next team and they go to the Super Bowl. That would be a great example where Kelsey's the perfect example of the opposite. We know they're saving him. Or maybe even Mahomes, I bet he puts up numbers in the postseason like he always does, So The Chiefs are probably an outlier just because they're, a kind of ahead of the curve on this thing. But I think that's a great point. I mean, a young ascending receiver, did the teams really trust them the most when it matters with the season on the line or not? That tells you a ton.
Yeah, I think it makes sense, like, having that added context. And again, it's not necessarily just the stat line, it's not necessarily just the performance, but you have to take all of these bits into account. And I think, sometimes knowing a team's postseason tendencies, like Matt, you mentioned the Kansas City Chiefs, we kind of know that, yeah, they might dial down things for Travis Kelce, leading up to the postseason in an effort to keep him healthy and an effort to keep him fresh. But we know usually once it comes to the postseason, it's all ties are cut loose. It's Kelce time. So like having an idea of a team's particular tendencies, super helpful in kind of leveling those evaluations. But then also, a great way to look at that level of trust in terms of just that player's kind of stance within the offense. And because I mean, let's be honest, like a player's trust level with the coaching staff in these big moments can be really indicative of their kind of long-term prospects within an organization.
We also have to acknowledge that some players just get really hot in the postseason, and it doesn't mean that they're going to be that way for the rest of their career. Matt, I think a perfect example is the run that Joe Flacco went on in 2015, right, where he was unstoppable, and then he never posted numbers like that ever again in his career. So, yes,
Eli Manning,
Eli Manning,
right, yeah.
CJ Anderson that one year for the Rams where he went absolutely bonkers, right?
Mm-hmm.
These games are obviously important, but don't overweigh what happens in 1, 2, or maybe even 3 games compared to what we saw throughout the entire 17 game schedule. It just doesn't seem very wise.
Yeah, I was thinking that with running backs in particular, that late in the season and sometimes into the postseason, you'll see a guy that comes out of nowhere that just has super fresh legs, that hasn't played since the preseason, that falls into a good environment and rips teams up for a couple games in a row. But that doesn't mean they can do it for 17 the next year. You know what I mean? Like, I'm trying to think of a good team. Like, let's say Cook gets hurt for the Bills and it's the Ray Davis show from now until the Super Bowl. That doesn't mean he's an RB1 next year.
Correct. Yeah, I think that's a really good example. So again, how you evaluate the players going into the postseason matters. Obviously, these games hold more weight maybe than one single regular season game, but don't overweigh one performance compared to the entire season. It's typically not a winning strategy. So that's our advice. Enjoy these playoff games. Have little reminders, write down some notes as you're watching these games, but do not overreact to Keon Coleman catching 6 passes for 99 yards in round 1. Like it matters, but it doesn't matter that much. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that is fair. And even times 1,000 in the Super Bowl. Someone has a huge Super Bowl, last taste in your mouth, and boy, they're the champs, and they're going to do it every game next year. Like, don't count on that.
Was it Chris Matthews from the Seahawks who had like 2 catches for 115 yards and 2 touchdowns against the Patriots that one year? Okay. And everybody thought that next season he was going to be something, and I don't think he caught a pass. So even then, a guy performing really well in the Super Bowl doesn't mean anything for the next year. Let's talk about our biggest dynasty regrets from the 2024 season. We will get to that next. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. From big upsets to game-winning drives, the NFL playoffs are better with FanDuel because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. That is $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. The FanDuel app gives you everything you need for live bets, same-game parlays, and so much more. I've already been checking out the lines this week. I'm kind of looking at that Steeler money line plus 400 against the Ravens. We'll see. I think that's going to be a really close game, but go check out all of the lines and odds available on FanDuel. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today, and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets. That is FanDuel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast. We're answering your mailbag questions, and this next one comes from Sarah. She wanted to know, what was your biggest offseason regret? Biggest in-season regret this year when it came to your dynasty teams. Matt, why don't you go first?
I'm struggling a little, to be honest with you, Sarah, but one thing is I need to fire more defensive coordinators on my teams. I mean, I'm in a couple leagues where I was the highest scoring team, and one of them I didn't even get in the playoffs. One of them I snuck in and lost in the first round just because bad luck in terms of letting up too many points, and to be honest, I did that on purpose just to say some of these leagues I'm in, I just wish the pot went more to overall points because that actually is skill. You know what I mean? As opposed to luck. It's just a big fantasy term overall. But I mean, I do think a high percentage of the pot should go to overall points as opposed to, boy, I came in third and got lucky and, didn't reach a Super Bowl or whatever. But anyway, there was one trade that I regret. The second I made it, and I still kind of regret it. It was one of these teams that's loaded. And I have tons of good receivers. I have Chase. I have Lamb. I mean, I have guys that are plug and play, no doubt. And JSN couldn't start for me. And I was light at running back. And I traded JSN, which I never do that. The young receiver that I adore, they're just off limits in my trade world. And I did it anyways. I broke my rule. And I traded JSN and Adonai Mitchell for Tracy, the running back from the Giants. That was my target. I need a young running back to start every week. And Amari Cooper. I mean, she wanted to get rid of Amari Cooper, and I'm like, I'll take him. Maybe I can move him in the offseason. It's not the worst trade in the world. Tracy has some value, but it's just not what I do. Trading two young receivers I was high on, especially JSN, who I adore.
Kate.
I think my biggest regret is maybe not diversifying enough when I realized things were going south. Now, sometimes I'll do this. I'll kind of get fixated on one player, or I will, what's the opposite of getting fixated? I will have a total aversion to a certain player. Like Devin Achane was the aversion player for me this year. I had Christian McCaffrey in a ton of leagues, and I wish I would have, when I saw things going south, when I started to see the warning signs, offloaded him in a couple of places just to diversify my portfolio, because I will tell you, I had, just absolute monster rosters. And I think the one thing that kind of held me out, I didn't win a single dynasty championship this year. I made it to the semifinals. I made it to the finals. It felt like it was always out of reach. And I think a big part of that was because I had sunk myself too far into the Christian McCaffrey world. I was worried that, okay, well, I'm not going to get enough return. I know he's injured, but he'll probably come back. And I do think if I would have diversified my portfolio a little bit more, that I would have seen some return. Now, it's not like I went out this offseason and acquired a bunch of Christian McCaffrey. He was already on my roster, but I just wish I would have hedged myself a little bit more. And I think that's something that I want to do a little bit more moving forward is, when I have a ton of shares of a player, hedge that a little bit, because Rashee Rice, another guy that I had almost in every single one of my dynasty leagues. And guess what? Every single one of my dynasty leagues, he's sitting in the IR spot. Chris Godwin, another guy that I went all in on this offseason. I need to rein it in a little bit when it comes to my diet, because a lot of my dynasty rosters, they look really similar. The builds are kind of similar. My biggest regret is just not shaking it up enough.
Mine is
real quick. A mistake I make, and I'm sure you guys do too, and I'm not even sure it's a mistake, but it leads you to the problem Kate just mentioned, is in rookie drafts, I end up with a lot of the same names. Yes. Because I love him and like, boy, he's my 8th ranked player and I get him at the 13th pick. I'm taking him every time,
So that's part of what mine is just not trusting my gut enough. I'm going to use an example. I'm going to pick on you guys a little bit. I remember it was back in March. We were doing kind of like pre-draft rookie ranks. And we were talking about Brock Bowers, and I went on the podcast and said, I think Brock Bowers is my number 1 overall tight end in Dynasty. And I felt that way going up through the draft, after the draft. But there was a couple of times where I drafted Brock Bowers and I ended up flipping him for, I remember the trade, Dalton Kincaid in a 1st round pick and like something else, thinking, okay, well, if I'm wrong on Bowers, at least I'm getting another tight end I really like in a first round pick, I should have just trusted my gut on that one. Like if you absolutely love a player, don't sell him for 110 cents on the dollar and try to piece him out in 3 different ways, because now you look at Brock Bowers, one of the top 10 most valuable fantasy assets, dynasty assets moving forward. So when you have a really strong gut feel, I'm going with the Dan Campbell philosophy of like, will I be able to sleep at night if I trade away this guy that I absolutely love? And the answer is no, that I can't.
That's a good one. I did the exact same thing with Bowers. I actually drafted him, and then like 2 picks. I only drafted him because he was falling, and I'm like, he's too much of a value. I have to have him at this price. And like 2 picks later, I traded him for a future first and something else. Like I never got 1 point out of him. He was on my team for like 48 hours.
And there are those guys where you trade them and in the pit of your stomach, you feel like, I could be wrong here. Mm-hmm. I would rather be wrong on a guy that I have full conviction on than to maybe trade away a guy that, I don't really care about and be right. I would just rather, I'd rather just live and die with the guys that I love that way.
I also think maybe this is another reminder. I think we're giving a lot of like kind of good philosophical things, but I think something we also do, we talked about recency bias in segment 1. I think this is kind of a good reminder that like, let's not give up on our takes because of recency bias. Like if you have a pretty strong conviction in a player, like Drake London, I felt very, very bullish on Drake London. He was by far my wide receiver 1 in that class. And I was a big believer in the talent. I thought, okay, right out of the gate, this is a guy that has the potential for a 10 touchdown season as a rookie. And I felt very bullish, but I still believed in the prospect, but I was like, okay, well, the situation's just not panning out. I gave up a little bit on Drake London. And once the stars kind of finally aligned, we started to see the prospect we initially drafted. And I think a lot of people gave up on, for instance, JSN far too quickly. Player that a lot of people liked, but when you don't get that immediate result, I think we tend to throw in the towel a little bit too quickly. I saw a lot of people do that this year, and I think there were a lot of regrets. So I also think, don't let recency bias affect you in the opposite way. Don't let some down performances sway. If you have super strong convictions about a player, maybe see them through a little bit longer.
All right, let's talk about our number 1 offseason trade target, because we're not that far away from player movement. I know there's already been one of my leagues has already been reactivated, getting ready for the 2025 season. We'll talk about our favorite targets next. This episode is brought to you by PrizePicks. It's playoff time, and if you're like me, you want to make the most of these final weeks of football action. That's where PrizePicks comes in. If you love football and want a chance to win real money while watching the games, PrizePicks is the place for you. It's the best way to turn your sports opinions into cash with daily fantasy player projections. With PrizePicks, you simply pick more or less on player stats like total passing yards or rushing touchdowns for a shot to win up to 1,000 times your money. You can make your picks in less than 60 seconds. And whether you're looking for a flex play to boost your payout or just want to cash out quickly, PrizePicks has got you covered. And with over 10 million members and billions in winnings, it's clear that people are absolutely loving this platform. I've been playing every week for a couple years now. I cannot recommend enough. And we've got a special offer for Locked On Dynasty listeners. Download the app today. Use promo code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That is $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Just download the app. Use promo code LOCKEDONNFL. PrizePicks, run your game. This episode is brought to you by Rocket Money. Did Rocket Money help you find any subscriptions that you forgot about or maybe were paying for twice? It definitely happened to me. I actually had 5 that I just completely forgot about. Rocket Money helped me cancel them and save a bunch of money. They've made it so easy to track them down. It's like having a personal assistant for your finances. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that helps you find and cancel your unwanted subscriptions. It'll monitor your spending and it'll help you lower your bills so that you can grow your savings. It brings everything together in one place, whether it's subscriptions, your spending habits, or even the goals that you want to hit this year. Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has saved a total of 500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year when using all of the app's premium features. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions and reach your financial goals faster with Rocket Money. Go to rocketmoney.com/lockedon today. That is rocketmoney.com/lockedon. rocketmoney.com/lockedon. Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. For your second listen, check out the new Locked On NFL show. 2 shows every single day, one in the morning with Tyler Rowland, one in the afternoon with Tony Wiggins. Those poor guys covering the Titans and Jags. I feel terrible for them. So go check them out on the Locked On NFL show, available wherever you get your podcasts. All right, Matt, we're getting close to the 2025 offseason in our Dynasty leagues. Who is going to be your number one trade target this offseason?
I have about 5 names, so I'll be real quick here. This is probably a whole podcast, but should we target any current NFL running back with the influx of running backs coming in the league?
No.
I have one. I got one.
For me. That's the only one I want.
Oh, okay. I went deeper down the list. I went for Ramondre Stevenson, just because I think the Patriots need everything, but they probably won't address running back. So maybe he falls into a situation where he actually has an offensive line and a passing game and doesn't fumble as much, and he's cheap.
Okay. It's a lot of ifs.
A lot of ifs, but I just think that's a lot of ifs. Yeah. I just think the environment has to be better for him. And I don't think the Patriots can afford to give him competition. That's the only reason, but he'll be cheap. 2 tight ends I like a lot better on tape than are going ADP right now are my man Freiermuth and especially Dallas Goedert. I just think they're both really good football players and will produce. 3 receivers that I think are good buy lows considering their stock and what might be around them next year are Waddle, probably minus Hill, Ayuk, probably minus Debo, and Olave, hopefully minus concussions. And my last one is I think Ben Johnson's going to be the Jags head coach. And this is a act now thing. But the second he becomes the head coach, Lawrence's stock's going to go through the roof. And I would also say Ingram, that Thomas is probably too expensive. All their stock will go up if this happens. But if you can grab Lawrence and Ingram now and either flip them when it happens or just live with it, I think you'd be happy.
We'd actually talked about Trevor Lawrence, I believe it was yesterday's podcast, because we're in the same boat. We think that Ben Johnson is going to get that Jacksonville job, and just everybody on that offense is going to have more value. Brian Thomas is being valued as like a top 6 receiver. I don't think it's the worst strategy to go pay for him now, because once Ben Johnson's announced as the coach, it's not like his value is going to go down. So so that's a really good call. Kate, who do you got?
I generally don't try to chase running backs. I foundationally build my teams around wide receivers, and the running backs are just kind of a toss away, wash, rinse, repeat, what have you. But I do think there are a couple of running backs that I just think the value is really intriguing for me right now. The highest on the list, and I'm going to be honest, this is like the first buy high running back that I've been like really in on. It's Bucky Irving. And right now in the month of December, RB8 and Dynasty Startup ADP, I'm a believer in the tape. I'm a believer in the statistical efficiency that we saw this year. And I'm also a believer that with the depth that they have at running back, I can't see the Bucs in the market for a running back. I think they got their value here in the 2024 class with Bucky Irving. They have Sean Tucker behind him. I think Bucky Irving is the real deal. We saw him be incredibly productive at Oregon, was a big time productive receiver at Oregon. So like that skill will translate as well. We know this offense is plenty friendly to the pass catching running back. I think he's the real deal, even though you have to buy high. A couple of other names, Chuba Hubbard, RB22 right now in Dynasty Startup ADP. He got an extension. He is by far and large that team's RB1 for the foreseeable future. After just burning a 2nd round pick on a running back, I don't think they can afford to dip their toes in this market again. I don't think they need to necessarily with Chuba on the roster. And finally, Matt, I think you're going to like this name. How about Tank Bigsby? So we
Yeah.
want to talk about buying in on the Jags roster. Tank Bigsby, a guy that I think there were a lot of people pretty high on in the draft evaluation process, and once we saw him land in Jacksonville, kind of backed off a bit because we thought, okay, well, Travis Etienne probably not going to be going anywhere, but I mean, Travis Etienne has been a Jag, just a guy in Jacksonville, and Tank Bigsby, I think, has looked like the much better and more consistent, more explosive running back over this past season. So those are 3 running backs I'm in on. Does anybody have any feelings about those 3?
Yeah, you said Travis Etienne, and I forgot that I bought him in a rookie draft. He should have been my biggest regret.
Oof, yeah.
Going back a segment. Yeah.
I like Tank Bigsby. Tank Bigsby seems like the perfect David Montgomery in Ben Johnson's offense. So I love that one. I've got 3 receivers. 2 of them are rookies. One's an older one. I think Michael Pittman is going to get moved this offseason, hopefully to a team with a good quarterback. He played with a broken back all year and still had like 800 yards, played with Anthony Richardson, which just nuked his fantasy value. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Colts get a better quarterback and Pittman has a much, much better season, or he gets traded because the Colts need draft capital to go get a quarterback. And he ends up, with Drake May, and he's back to being a 1,200 yard receiver. The 2 rookies, Rome Odunze, Xavier Worthy. I'm fully in on Xavier Worthy. Rashee Rice is going to be suspended next year. We'll see if DeAndre Hopkins is back. Hollywood Brown is a free agent. There's an alternate world in which Worthy has 1,100 yards and 14 touchdowns this year if he had a more accurate quarterback, which is hilarious to say about Patrick Mahomes, but it's the truth. And then Rome Odunze, because I thought he was a top 5-6 player in this class. It was a terrible year for Chicago. They're going to get an offensive-minded head coach. I think Caleb and Rome will figure it out eventually.
That is actually, I think Rome Odunze is a great example of a player that, I said, don't give up on your evaluations too quickly. I think Rome's a great example of that. I think Caleb Williams is a great example of that.
Rome might be JSN from a year ago. Kate, I mean, you mentioned
100%.
him. Yeah, exactly the same
he
guy.
Was absolutely a blue chip prospect. I thought he had one of the safest floors of any wide receiver in this class. Maybe not as flashy as a Malik Neighbors, but not as flashy as Brian Thomas Jr. But I think Rome Odunze, when all is said and done, I think his skill set is one that generally provides a very safe floor. And 734 receiving yards, 3 touchdowns as a rookie. I think that's a pretty solid floor considering how this season played out for the Bears.
I could probably be convinced to go after Marvin Harrison Jr. too.
Yeah.
I mean, I think he finished as wide receiver 30 this year. If somebody's willing to give him up for anything outside of wide receiver 10 prices, I'm all in, Matt.
Yeah.
It's instant. All right, that is it for today's show. We want to thank you for making Locked On Dynasty Football your first listen every single day. Check out the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We are free and available on all platforms. Follow Matt on Twitter at WilliamsonNFL. You can follow Kate at Kate Modjuk. I'm at Marcus_Mosier, and we will see you right back here tomorrow.